Moving faster doesn't necessarily mean better, and that's certainly true when it comes to generating code. We need to ensure the code we're committing to our code base from GitHub Copilot and any other source is quality and follows our practices. Let's see what the data says about code quality when we're using GitHub Copilot. I'm joined today by Jared. Jared, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the study and research that you've done, I want to start with kind of a little bit of level setting that I think chances are everybody already knows the answer, but why is quality of code so important?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the most important things to think about for code quality is that while the quality of the code is that you're authoring is really important, it's really a lot of the effects on the team. So one of the things that you see for good quality code is that teams feel more productive and they feel more satisfied. And so there's a lot of different ways you can think about code quality, but what we see is when teams have these quality code bases that are readable, that are more functional, and that are easier for them to maintain, you can see that they have these benefits. And then also it really has a big impact on their ability to maintain that code base over time. And you can see the benefits in terms of how long it takes for them to resolve an issue that they can find in the code base. There was research that showed that it can take up to the cycle time for resolving an issue in a low quality code base can actually be as much as 9 times as long. And so it's a really big impact on the developers, the amount of time that they're spending to do this work, and then also their satisfaction and level of productivity while they do that work.
So it sounds like then it's a real big part of developer experience, DevX, that oftentimes when we're talking about that, we're thinking about tooling, but it sounds like just having good code, a good place in which to work is also really important there.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's really not that surprising when you think about it. If your code base is well written, it's easy to read, it's easy to operate on, it's easy to maintain, you're going to feel more satisfied in the work you're going to do, and you're going to feel more productive while you do that work. And so, it's like if you're a chef, you would want to work in a clean kitchen. And it's the same sort of thing where developers want to write good code and be around a code base that has those different characteristics that we talked about.
So if we're going to introduce then a tool like GitHub Copilot, which is of course going to have a profound impact on the code that my developers write, how they're going to do it, the amount of code that they're going to wind up generating, I want to make sure that what we're going to get out of all of that will be quality. So what did your study show? Let's actually start with what was the structure of your study?
What we did is we asked developers to author API endpoints for a web server. And so we had over 200 developers with at least 5 years of experience using Python author these endpoints. In the end, there was about 200, a little bit over 200 valid submissions that we analyzed. And we looked at the functionality of the code, because if code's not functional, it's impossible to say it's high quality.
Right.
So, and what we found was one of the main findings was that people who had access to Copilot, they were more than 50% more likely to pass all of the 10 unit tests that we had to evaluate the code. So they were much more likely to write functional code. After we looked at the functionality of the code, we went back and had a line-by-line review by those developers of the code, and they were blind to whether or not it had been authored with Copilot or authored without Copilot. And what we found was that the code that was authored with Copilot was rated consistently and statistically significantly as being more readable. They went through and looked for all of the different defects you might find in code on a line-by-line basis, and there was a higher percentage of those line-by-line issues. Over 13% higher number of defects in the code were identified in a blind review by the developers in the code that was written without Copilot. So you can imagine in a real world setting, this would result in comments or suggestions for changes on that code. And so that would have a real big impact on the productivity of a team. If you're spending a lot of time resolving issues with the code quality, you're not able to merge a code. It's going to drive your productivity. And so this study really helps kind of identify how you can imagine this could impact like your level of satisfaction as a developer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point that you make there when it comes to the amount of time that it would take then to merge in, because a lot of times when we're thinking about productivity, we're thinking about just this is the raw code that I'm generating, but then we don't think about the rest of the process oftentimes of like, hey, I now need to get this reviewed, I need to get this to merge in, I need this to pass all of my tests, all of the reviews.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, and that's really kind of what we saw is that when you write the good quality code up front, you can see that people are going to spend less time having to struggle to really understand what was written. And so it's going to take them less time to do the review. And there's going to be less things that will also need to be addressed as a result of that review. And so one of the findings that we had, we asked the participants how likely they would be to approve the code that would have been, in a pull request. And they were 5% more likely to suggest that the code that was written with Copilot could be approved. So we see that in this lab study, how that could really impact your ability to make sure that code is ready to be merged.
What were the other takeaways that you got from the study?
We asked them to evaluate the code in a couple of different ways, and we found that they rated it as being more readable, more reliable, and they perceived it as being also more maintainable. Developers who were using Copilot also felt more confident. And so I think that that's a really important part of it, because it's really the confidence that Copilot gives you to write better quality code that I think is really the kind of one of the key takeaways here. So when we talked about code being concise, one of the things that was really interesting of this study that I think is a really important point is that when the developers wrote code with Copilot, they actually wrote a lot more code with Copilot. They wrote about twice the amount of code, but they deleted even more than that. So the developers using Copilot were actually writing commits that were a little bit shorter in the end. So their code was actually more concise, even though it was more functional. So they have more concise code, more functional code, but they were iterating on the code a lot more.
That's interesting. So they were doing like a lot of refactoring just locally on their own and making sure then that the code was the quality they were looking for. And they were able to do that because they had that increased sense of confidence.
That's really one of the main benefits of Copilot, is that you can spend less time doing your work, but you have more opportunities to sort of polish and iterate because you have the confidence that you're going to be able to get back to a satisfactory solution and make sure that the code is still functional.
When I think about writing code myself as a developer, my first step, of course, is like, let's just make this thing work. And then I'll go back and make it pretty. But a lot of times, if I'm under a time crunch, that second part just doesn't happen. And so if I have access to Copilot, now I'm able to move faster. Now I have more time to then go back and make it look pretty. And it sounds like you've kind of seen that then in the study.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We were giving the developers more time to work through and make sure the code was readable. Copilot afforded them different ways to think about it, and they could approach the problem in ways that were more readable as well.
So we talked an awful lot about code quality, and we've also talked a little bit about maintainability. Have you done research? What can you share as far as maintainability goes?
This is the next area that we really want to explore. We really want to understand, you're getting all these benefits from Copilot when you're authoring the code, but do you really get those same benefits when you're going back and doing the maintenance on the code as well? Everybody has some legacy parts of their code base they want to update, and we really want to understand, are developers able to get some of those benefits and take advantage of their ability to write better quality code and approach their code base maintenance in a way that allows them to have some of these same benefits that we saw, or maybe they don't translate, but this is the area that we really want to continue to do research in, because I think it could be really critical for the overall productivity of developers who are using Copilot.
Absolutely. Jared, thank you so very much for sharing your knowledge and for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
What really stuck out to me about that conversation is how the data showed the improvements that we saw both with code quality, but also with the confidence our developers had, allowing them to better refactor and to create code that was more likely to be approved during code reviews. To learn more and to read the study, check out the link, and thanks for joining as we went beyond the commit.